the queen who won Henry VIII's war for him. Imagine being sent to a foreign country at 16 to marry a prince you've never met, watching that prince die months later, then spending the next 7 years as a political pawn nobody quite knows what to do with. And then imagine that, years after finally becoming queen, your husband sails off to war and leaves you in charge of the entire kingdom. Not as a figurehead, as the one actually running it. And while he's away winning a minor skirmish in France, you organize an army, crush an invading force, and send him a piece of a dead king's coat as a trophy. That is Catherine of Aragon. And the strange part isn't just that she did this. It's that almost nobody remembers it because the ending of her story, a discarded wife, replaced and humiliated, completely buried the beginning, where she was arguably the most capable military mind in the entire Tudor court. So here's what this video is actually about. Most people, if they know Catherine of Aragon at all, know her as wife number 1, the one Henry divorced to marry Anne Boleyn, the one who got pushed aside so the Tudor dynasty could try for a son. What most people don't know is that for a brief, decisive moment in 1513, Catherine wasn't a wife waiting on the sidelines of history. She was the actual head of state, running England's defense, while her husband was 300 miles away, failing to accomplish nearly as much. And I'll save the second half of this story for the end, because once you hear about another woman, this one from 300 years before Catherine even existed, who did almost exactly the same thing, except with contemporary chronicles describing her personally leading troops in the field, impressive for a queen, stops being the right way to think about any of this. Let's start with where Catherine actually came from, because it explains everything that happens later. She wasn't raised to be decorative. Catherine was the youngest daughter of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. The same Isabella who personally led troops on campaign during the Reconquista, the decade-long military effort to drive the last Muslim kingdom out of Spain. Isabella didn't sit at home while her husband fought. She rode with the army, she organized supply lines, she was present at sieges. And Catherine, born in 1485, spent her early childhood literally growing up in and around military campaigns, moving from camp to camp with her mother during the final years of the Reconquista. By the time she was a teenager, she had watched up close what it looked like for a woman to hold real command authority in wartime. This is not a footnote. This is the entire key to understanding what she does later in England. At 16, she's sent to marry Arthur, Prince of Wales, heir to the English throne. Arthur dies 5 months later, likely from illness, and Catherine is left in a strange limbo, technically still tied to the English crown through a betrothal to Arthur's younger brother Henry, but with no wedding actually happening for years. She spends the better part of a decade in England, essentially in political purgatory, watching her value as a diplomatic asset rise and fall depending on the politics between Spain and England at any given moment. It's not a glamorous stretch of her life. It's closer to house arrest with better clothes. Then, in 1509, Henry VII dies. The 17-year-old Henry VIII becomes king, and in one of the more surprising decisions of his early reign, he marries Catherine almost immediately. For the first several years of their marriage, by most accounts, it's a genuine partnership. Catherine is smart, well-educated, fluent in multiple languages, and trained from childhood in exactly the kind of statecraft an ambitious young king would want in a wife. And in 1513, Henry decides to prove himself as a warrior king by invading France, joining an alliance against the French crown. And he does something that tells you exactly how much he trusted her. He leaves her in charge of England, not as a symbolic gesture. Catherine is formally named regent and governor of the realm, with real authority to act in the king's name while he's out of the country. And almost immediately, that authority gets tested, because Scotland, allied with France, sees Henry's absence as the perfect opportunity to invade northern England. This is the part of the story that deserves way more attention than it gets. James IV of Scotland crosses the border with a large force. And Catherine, pregnant at the time, doesn't just delegate the response to a general and wait for updates. She personally organizes the mobilization of the English army, reportedly drafting rousing speeches invoking her mother's military legacy, and by some accounts, she prepared to ride north herself in armor if the situation demanded it. Whether or not she physically joined the army in the field, she was unquestionably the person directing England's response at the highest level, at a moment when a failure would have meant a Scottish army loose in northern England while the king and his forces were stuck across the Channel. The English army meets the Scots at Flodden Field in September 1513. It is not close. James IV is killed in the fighting, the last British monarch to die in battle, along with a huge portion of the Scottish nobility. It's one of the most decisive military victories in English history, and it happens under Catherine's authority, while Henry is besieging a minor French town that historians generally consider a fairly unremarkable military achievement in comparison. And then Catherine does something that tells you she understood exactly what had just happened. She sends Henry a piece of the dead Scottish king's bloodied coat, along with a letter suggesting it as a banner for his own victory celebrations in France. It's a message wrapped in a gift. I won a real war while you were away. It's sharp, it's confident, and it's very hard to reconcile with the meek, pious image of Catherine that survives in most popular retellings of her life. For years after Flodden, Catherine remained genuinely influential, trusted, respected, politically capable in a way most royal wives of the era simply weren't allowed to be. And that makes what happens next even harder to sit with. As the marriage wears on and Catherine fails to produce a surviving male heir, Henry becomes convinced their marriage was cursed, invalid from the start, because Catherine had briefly been married to his brother Arthur. What follows is years of legal and theological warfare, the king's great matter, as Henry tries to get the marriage annulled so he can marry Anne Boleyn. And Catherine, the same woman who once ran a kingdom and won a war, refuses to go quietly. She fights the annulment for years, defends her marriage's legitimacy in formal legal proceedings, and never once concedes the argument. Until her death in 1536, she continued signing her letters Catherine the Queen, refusing to acknowledge any title but the one she believed was rightfully hers. She died separated from her daughter Mary, largely isolated from court, having spent her final years effectively demoted from the woman who once governed a kingdom to a discarded former wife fighting a legal battle she would never win. It's a brutal contrast. The same capability that made her trustworthy enough to be handed a kingdom in 1513 wasn't enough to save her status 2 decades later. So that's Catherine's story on its own. A queen whose most consequential act, winning a war and running a country, gets treated as a footnote, buried under the story of her divorce. Here's the part I promised you. The part that shows this wasn't a one-off. 300 years before Catherine was even born in anglo-saxon England, a woman named Ethelfled, daughter of Alfred the Great, did something similar, except the historical record leaves far less room for doubt. Ethelfled ruled as Lady of the Mercians after her husband's death, and contemporary chronicles don't describe her as a regent quietly managing affairs from behind the scenes. They describe her personally leading military campaigns against Viking-held territory, commanding forces in the field, and overseeing the construction of a network of fortified towns, burhs, specifically designed to defend Mercia and push back Scandinavian control of England. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle records her military campaigns directly by name as her actions, not her husband's, not a general acting in her name. She led. It says so plainly in the oldest surviving English historical record, Put the two women side by side and the point sharpens, instead of repeating itself. Catherine shows you that even in the rigidly patriarchal world of Tudor England, a queen could be trusted with real military authority and could win with it, and still get erased from the popular version of her own story. Ethelflaed shows you this wasn't a rare exception born from unusual circumstance. Centuries earlier, in a much rougher and more violent England, a woman could hold direct, undisputed military command, and the record simply says so. So which is the real story? The queen who won a war and got erased for it? Or the queen who led armies herself and made it into the history books doing it? Maybe it's both. Maybe the real pattern here is that history had room for capable women commanding armies far more often than the popular version of the past ever admits. It just didn't always bother to remember them for it. If you want to see what happened when Henry finally got his annulment and what it actually cost everyone involved to get there, there's a video right here that covers it. Go watch that next. And if you're not subscribed yet, hit the button so you don't miss what's coming. And let me know in the comments, was Catherine of Aragon the strongest of Henry's 6 wives? I'll be reading them.